Good morning. Welcome to the study of Gothic art. This is the last unit in our long history of early Western art from prehistoric to Gothic. Now, some of you have heard the term Gothic or Goth, and it's kind of a little segue, but some of you may be wondering, does this have anything to do with people that we know that are Goths? And recently I've had students ask me this, and the Goth movement, for anyone who doesn't know, is a movement of people that sort of have a dark view, if you will. It's a way of dress. There is a whole lifestyle to it. You can go to websites and you can sort of look up this dark symbology of the Goths, if you will. And so if you wear black clothes and black lipstick and black mascara and cut your hair a certain way, somebody might say, oh, you're a Goth. They didn't have them when I was in high school. That'll date me. But I'm told that there are Goths in high schools and universities today. Now, there's such a thing as Gothic literature, which came around the 19th century or so, and is a sort of an outgrowth to Romantic literature. And Gothic architecture figures prominently in Romantic literature. Now, Mary Shelley, people like that, she was a Romantic writer. If those of you that know your English literature history know that she wrote the book Frankenstein, which was later popularized into a series of movies. All of these different sorts of factors are influences that when this other movement came to be much, much later, they latched onto this sort of 19th century ideal, some of the themes that came out of that literature, and then termed it Goth. But I would be willing to venture to guess that few of the people that term themselves Goths completely relate themselves to Gothic architecture. And the question that the student posed to me, and the reason I'm going into this a little bit now, is what she said was, if Gothic architecture is an architecture of light and seeking to God, how is it that the Goths that I know are so dark? So it's an interesting thing, and you can Google it. You have to do I did spend quite a little time trying to get to the origins of it, and I'm sure I've just scratched the surface, but I find language fascinating and I find history fascinating. So that's my little intro today. And it brings me into this first slide, which is, we visualize history as a stack of chronological layers of periods. Logical, right? Kind of like math. This happened, so then this thing happened, so then this other thing happened. But this will not work for the Gothic age, and in all reality, it doesn't work for most of history moving forward, because humans are different in different parts of the world, and we cannot define this Gothic age in terms of time alone, because different things are happening in the 12th, 13th century, and even into the beginning of the 14th century, which we call the beginning of the international style. But different parts of the world, different things are being emphasized. So the term Gothic literally means the Germanic tribes who sacked Rome in AD 410. Remember them? We've been talking about these Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the other Goths, who we've seen them in Spain, we've seen them in Rome, we've seen them attack Charlemagne, the Ottonians. We've talked about them in relationship to the Vikings. They invaded Greece and Italy, but that name has nothing to do really with the origins of Gothic art. Although many of these northern people could trace their ancestral roots to these Gothic tribes. The Gothic era, as we are going to define it for this unit, and again, so here I've used the term Gothic in so many different ways already. So in each context, it's important to understand the term and how we're using it at any particular moment. This particular era begins in a specific date. So you've got I got a date you can write down. Oh, a date. Yes, 1140 CE with a man named Abbot Suger in France. And this era lasted for about 150 years in some places, so not very long, but then in other places over 400 years. And we're going to see over the next 2 or 3 lectures. I'm not sure if it's going to be 2 or 3 because I'm still working on these. And this first one turned out to pretty much be mostly a little bit of background in almost all architecture. But it really does. We see a gradual shift from architectural work to pictorial work. And in the beginning, at least, the architecture is the center, as we shall see. So the age of the cathedrals runs from roughly 1150 to 1250, so about 100 years, and architecture dominates during this time. Then, during this time, sculpture begins as architectural sculpture, and you're going to see a shift even in the sculpture on the cathedrals, and as examples, we'll use Chartres and Reims for that. But after 1200, we have independent sculpture coming, and a flowering of this between 1200 to 1420. Now, painting, we don't see as much of it in the north. It peaks between 1300 and 1350 in central Italy. North of the Alps, we really don't see a lot of painting until 1400 on, and it falls into the early Renaissance, and we look at it more in Survey 2. Early Gothic sculpture and painting reflect the discipline of the cathedral setting. The cathedral is the center, and it will be our defining forum, if you will. Although later Gothic artists do strive for some pictorial effects. And we see it a little bit in some of the sculpture on Reims. We see just the beginning of it. So again, we can pinpoint this appearance of this style with great accuracy in the Ile-de-France with this man, Abbot Suger. He belonged to the French royal monastery at Saint-Denis, which is about 6 miles north of Paris. And then this style moves out of France in different ways. So in Italy, there's much more of a classical form that has to do with the fact that they have all of that influence of classical Rome right there, and also the fact that they have earthquakes. And this style is very slow to take hold in Germany, but then the Germans hang on to the Gothic style well into the 16th century, even up until the time of Martin Luther. So here's some of our characteristic styles: elegant soaring buildings, light, color, transparency. And historically, what's happening is towns are gaining prominence. So people are moving into towns, moving into cities. We're having a civic life. We're having communal identity. So they begin to build these cathedrals as a reflection of this identity. And so where in the Romanesque period we saw monasteries as the centers for the church and the centers for power, now this power moves to these urban cathedrals. And again, you could use that old saying, follow the money. The finances, the resources go to the cathedrals as well. So historically and economically, it's a very interesting period. If you are interested in such things, I'm not quite sure what any titles of them would be, but there's probably some very interesting histories about this economic transition. Now, during the Middle Ages, they quarried several million tons of stone. There were 80 cathedrals built, and we're only going to look at a few of them because this is a survey class. There were 500 large churches aside from the cathedrals, and then, of course, tens of thousands of parish churches. So it was a building time until the Black Death hit, but that's another story. So churches dominated their surroundings, and they are the center of urban life. They're expensive. The bishops have power. There's love and admiration here, as well as resentment and fear. They're taking all the money, but at the same time, it's just beyond imagination the way they can build these churches. We've got the Crusades continuing, so Byzantine elements, Islamic elements, works from classical antiquity, all of these ideas and images are flooding into Europe. So there's debate, there's an intellectual stimulation, there's reason, philosophy, and science beginning, and we're going to see these exemplified in Aquinas and Suger. We have the intermingling of logic and mysticism into studies of Christianity. ideas of romantic love, unconsummated desire, the desire for what somebody cannot have. And so on the one side, there's this idea of control, of love of God, of urbanization. But then on the other side, there's these disasters. The Black Death happens. 40% of the population of Europe is depleted. It's the disaster like a nuclear war. We cannot even imagine. Imagine if 40% of the people in the town you live in just suddenly died, and so few people are left. And then, of course, we had this feudal system that we've been discussing. But if you've lost 40% of the population, labor's going to even out because stuff needs to get done. Crops need to be brought in. Things need to be built. So people that have never done anything for themselves all of a sudden have to pick up a shovel, for example. So it's evening out this power split somewhat. And last but not least, we have this culmination. We have the Great Schism of 1378 and 1417. We have one pope in Rome, another in Avignon. They both claim legitimacy. And I've given you a link here. These are some, there's a whole series of these wonderful medieval lectures. And this particular link that I've given you talks about this Great Schism. And it's really gives you some wonderful background for this time in history. So here's our friend, the map, and we are going to be concentrating for the purposes of this lecture in Germany and France, just this very small area right here in a very short span of time. And it's always makes me think when I look at these maps and we think about the influence on Western art and history that this very tiny area and this very tiny time frame actually has had on art and society and culture moving forward. So begins at Paris, eventually spreads throughout Europe, eventually becomes what we call international style, although Italy never incorporates it completely. And we're going to begin this study with a study of the cathedral. And I've hinted at this already because really the cathedral is the cornerstone of Gothic art. And we're going to use for our focus a cathedral that's called Chartres Cathedral. And although there were many others. And all other arts are included in the cathedral just to enhance the religious space. The stone edifice of the cathedral, everything within it, including the faithful, symbolize God and his creation. So it's a big symbol of the life of the time. So we've really got four factors that cause this emergence of this Gothic style in France. One, population explosion in urban communities. This happens when many people move out of the country into the city. Paris starts replacing the small monastic communities. They start building cathedrals, which then brings up more people in, which then brings more cathedrals, which then brings more people. So it's this symbiotic relationship, if you will. And we have the Capetian line rising, so very powerful under Louis VI. They're marrying for wealth, for prestige. Louis VII married Eleanor of Aquitaine, so he gained the biggest feudal estate in all of Western Europe. So they recognized that land and power equals power, and Louis IX actually became a saint, that this monarchy, the Capetian monarchy, recognized that this alliance that we've talked about so many times before between church and state brings power. And they took that to its limit, and France actually into the 16th century is one of the most powerful nations in Europe. So the style, it's really a fusion of reason and emotion. We have reason with a man named Thomas Aquinas, who has scholasticism, and then Abbot Suger is mystic. So, again, the French monarchy, in particular Louis VI and Louis VII, control the Ile-de-France, and this is the whole region around Paris that's the core of France during the Romanesque period. It's a seat of power, nobles in other regions, and then once they annex Eleanor of Aquitaine's lands, they have a great deal more power, although eventually she left Louis and married Henry Plantagenet. So if you know your English history, you know this is the beginning of the 100 Years' War. And here's a lecture about that from that same site. Again, I'm pointing you to these lectures because you're all like, this is an art class, not a history class, but we need the history to understand the art. Here is the chalice of Abbot Suger. And the chalice, of course, holds the wine for the Eucharist. And here's a little biography. He was born in 1084. He was educated in the monastery of Saint Denis, where he eventually becomes the abbot. And he and Louis VI were educated together. So they were boyhood friends, and he became an advisor to Louis VI and the Louis VII. He also was a mediator between the church and the royal family to the point where he was even the regent of France while Louis VII went to the Crusades. So, of course, he was appointed the abbot in 1122. Saint Denis was the burial place of the French royal family, so it had great resources. So he rebuilt the monastery, he rebuilt the cathedral as a spiritual center of France. The first building we'll look at is Saint Denis because it will show you how the Gothic architecture evolved. And if you can remember back at the end of the Romanesque lecture that I gave you last time, we talked about some of these transitions. So Abbot Suger is a representative of mysticism. And the interior of the Gothic cathedral really is a mystical experience because we have emotion, we have sensation associated with the body, and through this emotion, through this sensation, one can get lost in emotion and become close to some sort of mystical spiritual transcendence. The Gothic artists, architects, and philosophers believed that light was symbolic of the immediate experience of the divinity. And this has been a running theme for Christian art ever since the earliest Christian art. Remember back to the play of light on the mosaics in the interior of the Galla Placidia. So it's a concept that's no stranger to us here. But now we have stained glass. We have the technology to bring this sensuous experience of light to its fullest realization because we can get all colors of the rainbow throughout religious imagery. So it's this play of light. It bounces off the gold objects inside the cathedral, the jewels on the vestments of the priests, the gemstones on the chalices, on all of the liturgical paraphernalia. In addition, we have the sounds of chanting and even scent, the aroma of incense. And if you remember, we had this idea of scent when we saw those early medieval manuscripts back in Mozarabic, Spain. So Suger, this is kind of funny, he studied what he thought were the works of Saint Denis, but they were actually the works of a mystic named Dionysius. Irregardless, he was inspired by this emphasis on mathematical harmony, and the concept is that there should be a harmony between the parts of the building and the effect of light. So he elaborated this whole idea into a whole very complex theory based on musical ratios. And so it's all of this complex symbolism based on mathematics. And if you listen to chants and music from this time, you could get somewhat of a flavor of this idea. So within 100 years of the onset of this building project, which you see illustrated here, there were 2,700 churches built just in the Ile-de-France, and then, exponentially all of the other ones we mentioned. So this is actually the interior from Chartres Cathedral, but it's a little bit better illustration because it's larger and you can see more of it, that these characteristics of the Gothic style are support, that light, the walls are perforated to allow more light to enter, verticality, there's a three-part elevation that moves the eye up toward heaven, elegant lines that move the eye up, and then, of course, unity. So this is a quintessential example of these characteristics that we're going to be looking at. Now, Thomas Aquinas, he's the other side. Remember, we talked about mysticism and rationality, and this is a page from Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologia, or the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. He followed this school of thought. It's called scholasticism, which really was a school that dominated during the medieval period, all of the medieval period, from early medieval throughout Romanesque and now. And so these scholars work to reconcile Greek philosophy, and in particular the philosophy of Aristotle, with Christianity. And we've talked about this before. And Aquinas really believed that all knowledge had to be obtained through studying all of God's creation. So, in other words, it's this evolution of thought that happens if after you have a few hundred years of human beings developing their brains, working, studying, reading, thinking, discussing. And there is actually been proven in psychology today that when these parts of the brain are exercised, they do develop. And so this is a thinking that has developed over years. And so he concluded that we can find basic geometric shapes in nature, and you can read about this in your book under Villard de Honcourt. And so he applied this to architecture. And these facades in the cathedral, there's a very numerical geometric codes in both the plans and the execution of the cathedral. So this is the facade of Chartres, and this is what it looked like before it was restored in the 19th century. So this, I wanted to find you an older engraving so you could see an image that's a little closer to what it looked like. It's always hard because we don't have engraving and many drawings from the time some of these things are built, so we have to rely on whatever images we have once the technology caught up with it. So this is what it looked like a couple hundred years after it was built, but I would venture to guess that it's pretty much what the original cathedral looked like. So Saint-Denis began as a Benedictine monastery, and then Suger brought in other masons and sculptors from other regions. And so this first cathedral, this is our first Gothic cathedral, and this west facade that you're looking at here was the very first part completed. So one thing that's different in this that you're going to see later in Chartres is the fact that it's got two different sizes of towers on the westworks, things like that. So you can tell Saint-Denis. But again, I wanted you to see the early version of this. So we can see here it's divided into three parts. We have this rose window. We have this portal that is a little bit different from the Romanesque portal, but the same idea. A lot of these elements of architecture that are on this church are familiar to you. This is the plan of the choir in Saint-Denis. So it's stemming, of course, from Roman pilgrimage churches. So we still have the architectural elements with the ribbed groin vaults, pointed arches, wall buttresses. All of that comes from Romanesque architecture. And again, we have the ambulatory for people to go around during this service. And we even have noticed these pointed arches here. So the sanctuary is semicircular, and then it's surrounded by an ambulatory with 7 chapels that radiate out from it. So let's review this vaulting from Roman architecture. So on this previous slide, we can see this detailing of the rib vaulting on the ceiling. And if you look over at this little plan, you can see where these little X's are. That's where these ribs are, and this line between them, you can see the line between them. So this is what that is a diagram of. So the round arch displaces most of the weight or the downward thrust. So to review, the round arches are displacing most of the weight in the vaulting. And sometimes They put buttressing on the outside of arches, that additional support. So if you look on the lower left where I've labeled the buttressing, you can see that part that sticks out from it. And over on the right of that, we have two barrel vaults that are intersecting. And when they intersect like that, the result is a groin vault. And these groin vaults were used in the construction of the Colosseum, if you remember. That was why the Colosseum could be round. So rib vaults, and what we just saw in that ceiling from Saint Denis of Suger were the ribs of the rib vaults. They're a form of groin vaults. So the ridges are the groins, and they're formed by these intersecting vaults. And then there's curved moldings that can either be underneath it or be covered over, and they strengthen the whole thing. They strengthen the joints. First they construct the ribs, and then they support the scaffolding of the vault. So over time, they become more and more intricate. So you can see on the left, we just have these different groins coming together. And then in the center, here's this pattern of ribs and this masonry webbing. And so eventually they become very, very complex. And this complexity and the designing of this complexity is one of the methods that the builders of these Gothic cathedrals used to achieve great height, which was one of their greatest aims. So, rib vault, extra masonry of ribs, demarcating the junctions of the groin vault. They can be purely decorative, but usually they're functional. And like the tripartite division in the nave, again, they really do move the eye up, and you can get some of the idea with this domical bay compared to this rib vaulted bay here. So if you have an interior that's comprised of all these rib vaults, it becomes very elegant. So here's the apse of Saint Denis. So this new architectural aesthetic based on line and light. Light and color are a means of uniting the soul with God. It's a little hard to see in this picture. It's very difficult for any photographers to be able to capture the light of stained glass, but you can get some kind of a hint that this is all stained glass. So it would be colored light that was filtering into this church. And if you go online, you can find wonderful pictures of this. So this becomes the prototype for a new architecture of space and light. It's all based on this skeletal framework. It's constructed from buttressed outer walls and then interior masonry vaults. So with that background, let's look at Chartres Cathedral, because Chartres, it's one of our earliest Gothic cathedrals, but it's a perfect example. It's got every element very, very easy to see, and easy to see the transition into the mature style. So it's seen as a transitional church in many ways. And the full Gothic style, of course, will come later in the cathedrals at Amiens and Reims. So it's really reflecting this transition from experimental 12th century architecture, which is what we saw in Suger's church at Saint Denis, to this mature 13th century style. And there is a huge conflict and controversy around the building of this church. And I chose to give you this side view. And in another place on your website, there's a file. It's just called Chartres Slides, and a lot of them aren't labeled, but there's just many, many different pictures and angles of this church. So you can see them, and you can also see some wonderful, there's wonderful YouTube videos of the interior of this church as well. So just a little tiny flavor, but at least here, you know, so often we just look at the facade, but we get a sense of the side view of it. And here's where, of course, the apse with the radiating chapels are, and we can see the transept. So here's our facade. So it's this connection between scholasticism and architecture, an edifice meant to illustrate the glory of God. It's logical, it's symbolic, and I'll try to unpack this for you a little bit. So we have a square. If you look, you know, it's a true square, and then it's divided into threes, vertically and horizontally, and then each part is further divided by three. So, of course, three symbolizes the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, as they called it then. And the construction of the stone down to every single brick, the size of every window, every group of threes is completely rational, carefully calculated. And in this philosophy, the building itself symbolizes the faithful. So their faith is like the stone. It's like a rock. Their faith is solid and unbreakable as the rock of the cathedral is. So their faith is a rock within a rock. So here is our plan of Chartres as it was designed circa 1194 to 1220. So it took around somewhere between 30 and 50 years to build it. And so the west portal, of course, is down here at the bottom at this end. And then here's these radiating chapels. So when we looked at our first view of it, we were standing over where the writing is, out the other way. You can sort of turn yourself around and imagine yourself being there. So the number 3, we have an equilateral triangle in the outer edges of the buttresses and the keystone of the vault in the nave, which of course represents the Trinity. Then the number 4, it's the material world. Combined together, they make the number 7. So the material world, we have 4 winds, we have 4 seasons, we have 4 directions, we have 4 rivers of paradise. Combined, the Trinity and the material world make the number 7. And so you can notice the combinations in the groin vaults and the crossings. So we have 3s, 4s, 7s, and 12s. Here's 2 views of the nave at Chartres. And it's one reason why Chartres really is a good illustration of this Gothic style is because it really is a good transition between Saint-Denis and the high Gothic style of Amiens. All of these churches exploit this tripartite elevation. So you can see here, first we have the pointed arches, the triforium gallery, which is this passageway above the nave, and then the clear story at the top. You can see better in the picture on the right. You can see the stained glass in the clear story. There are also, of course, stained glass windows behind this gallery. You can see just a hint of it a little bit here on the bottom, the light coming in. So all 3 of these elements move the eye up towards heaven. And of course, everyone would have been standing. None of these benches and chairs and things would have been there. From a distance, the most prominent features are, of course, this huge stained glass window, which you can see from miles away, and the 2 towers with their spires. So it's a very, very obvious connection. And you can see that these 2 towers also are not quite the same height. Again, like Saint-Denis, one is a little lower than the other one. So I want to talk to you about stained glass. And in the 5th edition of Stockstead, anyway, you can find it on page 569. Chartres is the only Gothic cathedral that still has almost all its stained glass windows. The World War II in particular was devastating to stained glass, not to mention other things that have happened throughout history to destroy these beautiful cathedrals and churches. But Chartres was famous for its glass-making workshops, and so most of this stained glass here actually dates between 1210 and 1250. So most of it is almost 1,000 years old. Isn't that something to think about? 1250, so that would be, 1200 is 800, we're in the year 2000, so yeah, 817 years. That's a long time ago. Isn't it something to think that it still exists in its pristine and beautiful original form? And the iconography in these windows echoes the portal sculpture, which we'll see in a moment. There's many, many scenes in these stained glass windows where we don't know the original meaning at all. And this slide, it's pretty hard to see. You have to really look closely. You can see it better on your computer. If you blow it up, it almost gets too pixelated, but I've got some other ones that are better. So nobody really knows. Maybe they're records of donations, maybe they're propaganda. We do know that there was quite the controversy around the building of Chartres, so who knows? Here's a better slide. So in this one, you can see details of their clothing, the cup this person is holding. So I've given you this definition of stained glass. They had many, many different colors. They had all sorts of different recipes for it. They put sheets of colored glass out on it, and then they cut it and joined it together with cames, which are like little lead strips. And they also even painted on it. And if you notice, for example, up in the upper right hand, about halfway up, you can see painting of the drapery on this figure up above this red and purple robe that this figure is wearing. And much of this painting, of course, you wouldn't even be able to see from the floor below, but these glassmakers were so detail-oriented. It's just unbelievable. So they reduced the figures to very simple shapes. The gestures were kept very, very broad, and you can't even see, as I've said, these fine lines from the floor of the cathedral, but the detail, every single panel has detail like this detail. Look at the beautiful flowers and the colored leggings on this fellow. And this guy's looking back. He's carrying whatever this is he has in his hand. It's hard for me to tell what it is. Probably some sort of food, I'm imagining. But he's looking back at him and he's looking back at her. And it's interesting to imagine what they're doing. We do know what these scenes are. These are scenes from the Passion of the Christ. We have 6 roundels. This is from the Passion and Resurrection window, which are the 3 lancet windows from the royal portals at the west end of the nave. Here's a detail of the rose window in the west facade showing the Last Judgment. And on the right, we have the north rose window with all 5 of its lancet windows. So it's hard to see from this type of image, but if you're inside a darkened cathedral, you might not see the architecture around these windows. Here's some details of the construction on the rose windows. So this is from the outside, and just the detailing in the cames and in the masonry, all the little tiny columnar detailing and little tiny divots and carving in every single little section of this. So these lancet windows in the west facade, along with the rose window, are the earliest windows on the cathedral, and they illustrate the Passion of Christ, the childhood of Christ, and the Tree of Jesse, which it's this one. So they form a triptych that confirms the prophecies of the Old Testament. Really, almost half of the clear story surface is covered with this stained glass, just pure colors. It completely changes the perception of space inside the cathedral. Here's a detail of that window we just looked at. This is at the top. So at the bottom, Jesse is sleeping wrapped in his blanket. This is the same illustration, the same imagery that we saw from Bernard of Clairvaux, now realized in this stained glass. And there's a tree springing from his groin, 4 kings of Judah in the branches, and then Mary and Jesus at the top, surrounded by doves. The clear story that I was just talking about is this very topmost elevation with these windows in it, but you can see that there's other windows down here. So this tripartite elevation. So here is your diagram, and this diagram's in your textbook also. So you can read this, and I've just given you all of this vocabulary. So from this particular diagram shows you Chartres, and the other Gothic churches are similar. There may be some slight differences, but these are the major parts for all of these churches. So here's an air view of Chartres from the southeast. And one of the most important techniques of this period is this flying buttress that I've been referring to. So all of these sort of skeleton masonry parts that are coming out from the church, where here it almost looks like ribs, it almost looks like scaffolding. This is actually part of the church, and it's what's holding it up. So what these flying buttresses do is they literally hold up the walls. They counteract this outward thrust because they transfer the weight, and they're also decorative. So they're forcing the viewer's eye upward toward heaven. And of course, we're looking at it from above, but that's another function that they have. Here they are. Here are the flying buttresses. And so we have a photograph of the buttress itself. And if you look over at this picture on the right, you can see where it is in the church. It's quite high up, almost to the roof. And so we also see the inside of the church. So let me unpack this for you. This is a place where it's harder to do this online. There's an image on the right that's labeled, and you can see the nave arcade, the triforium gallery, and the clerestory. If you turned yourself so that you could stand, if you cut the church and looked from the side, each one of those vertical lines that leads from the roof down through the clerestory all the way down to the floor at the bottom of the nave arcade, you can see that that line is the wall line that's illustrated and that is attached at the very top point by these buttresses, by this flying buttress at the very top. And then all of it is attached all the way down this line. And this arrow indicates to you the thrust of it. Here's a view if you're standing up higher above it on the roof. And just imagine being one of these workmen building this cathedral, and stone by stone. And of course, this is all set stone. It's so carefully carved stone. They're so beautifully carved that they're just sitting one on the other, like just masonry. It's unbelievable. And with the stained glass inset and all of these buttresses built onto it. So this shows you that connection point that I was just talking about. And here it is from the inside. So the triforium is overlooking the nave through this arcaded screen. So you can actually go inside where that triforium is. And then we see this 4-part vaulting, and each part of the vaulting attaches to this great connection where the flying buttresses are attached on the outside. So another view from above of this important connection at the base of the roof line. So you can see the windows, and you can imagine the clerestory with letting all this light in, and then the triforium gallery beneath it, and all the way down that tripartite elevation down to the floor. So again, the royal portal is supporting the theme of the 3 stained glass windows above. On the right, we have Mary as the throne of wisdom, and narratives of the childhood of Christ are all illustrated on the lintel. So here's a detail of the central portal. Christ is in majesty. He is surrounded, of course, by the symbols of the 4 evangelists in a full-body mandorla. So very different than this Last Judgment tympanum that we saw at Autun previously. Serene, noble, balance, control, synthesis of scholasticism, of unity, of study. The 24 elders on the archivolts are joined by the angels, and on the lintel, the apostles are joined by Elijah and Enoch. And here are the jam statues from Chartres. The jam statues on this portal are showing Old Testament precursors to Christ. So this same narrative theme that we have throughout this theological architecture, the kings, the queens, the patriarchs, all of the prophets that are bearing witness to this church as this fulfillment to all of these prophecies in the Old Testament. So a jamb is a vertical element on both sides of an opening. So here you can see Christ in majesty, and here he is as above, and then of course Mary on the right. So he's serene, he's noble, he's controlled. And here's the detail of the face. It's almost as though he's meditating. We have this benevolent look to him. These are the prophets and ancestors of Christ. They're columnar and they're floating. If you notice that their feet are just dangling, so they're otherworldly figures. It's almost as though they're of this world, but not of this world. Now on the south transept, they're a little bit more naturally proportioned. They're created between 1210 and 1235. So we can see these as a transition to what we're going to see a little bit later in Reims. So on Chartres, again, we begin to see the evolution of sculpture. Much more strong physical presence. These figures are more in the world than the previous figures. So here's a comparative cathedral nave elevations. And for the most part, these cities are competing to create the largest and highest Gothic cathedral until they built Beauvais Cathedral, which collapsed. So here we have the cathedral at Paris, and then we have Chartres here, and Reims, which is a little higher, and then Amiens, which is the high Gothic style, and then, of course, we don't have Beauvais because it collapsed. So here's the west facade of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Reims. Very, very different. It's a good example of high Gothic architecture. It was the coronation church for the French monarchy, and if you recall, Reims has been the center for the arts ever since Carolingian times. So we have this exploitation of the pointed arch. The portal is very, very deep, very elaborate, and we have this multiplication of these pointed arches now. This deep tracery that is a hallmark of the high Gothic style as well. Here's the nave of Reims Cathedral. We've got 2 rose windows here with the lancets underneath them. Much narrower, much higher. They've figured out how to gain even more height and more light. And the sculpture at Reims, here is some of the portal sculpture. You notice it's much more developed, much more naturalistic. This is the Annunciation. And here's the Annunciation and Visitation. So now, unlike the figures at Chartres, these figures are fully planted on their pedestals. There's weight on their feet, and not only that, they are interacting with each other. Each of the 2 groups are speaking with one another, and so beautifully detailed. And even we have this very slight S-curve in these figures that is a precursor of 14th century art and into the Renaissance. So these statues were executed about 100 years later than the jam statues on Chartres. So this use of the S-curve is a hallmark of the French court style. Here is a comparison of Amiens and Reims. Now we just looked at Reims, now we have Amiens. So really these Gothic tastes are favoring increasingly sculptural, ornate facades. Both Amiens and Reims were built after they were burnt, and the respective churches, they bent all of their efforts to building them. They raised funds from their estates, from trade fairs. Here's the nave in Amiens. It's hard to tell from these pictures, but I wanted you to get a flavor from all 3. And here are the plans of Reims and Amiens. Here's the Beau Dieu from the Trumeau in the central portal on the west front facade of Amiens. You can note how naturalistic the figure is, how beautifully done the drapery is, very, very solid, almost human. Almost looks like you could step right off of there. Now, the Church of Sainte-Chapelle was built under St. Louis to hold the crown of thorns, and the entire church is made out of stained glass. It was restored in the 19th century, but they originally date from the 13th century, and there's over 620 square meters of stained glass in it. So it's just amazing.